All right, I heard you. You want to learn more about buttons. You like this button conversation, so let's give you more button talk. So we've already learned how to make vertical buttonholes, and if you didn't catch that video, go back to my channel and check out how to draft buttonholes on your pattern. And today we're going to talk about what if you want the buttonhole to go horizontally? What kinds of things do you need to think about? When would you use a horizontal buttonhole versus a vertical buttonhole? And how do you draft that on your pattern? That's what we're going to be talking about today, so let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Trisha. I call myself your pattern nerd friend, and we love talking about pattern making, fitting, and all things sewing here on my channel. So if this is your kind of thing, please hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications so you never miss a video from me. We do this thing called Tricky Thursdays here on Thursday, where I share a tip or trick with you related to one of those three topics. And I shared a video a little bit ago about how to draft buttonholes for your pattern, and we did vertical buttonholes. I asked you if this was something you were interested in learning more about, and as you saw earlier, I got the response that yes, we want to talk more about buttons and buttonholes for your pattern. So that's what we're here to do. Today we're going to be talking about, instead of vertical buttonholes, we're going to talk about horizontal buttonholes. Now, first question is, when do you use which one? So most of the time you're probably going to see vertical buttonholes, like on your button-up shirts and jackets and things that you have. A lot of times those are going to be vertical buttonholes. The reason for that is because anytime you do a buttonhole or a button, you have to have that reinforcement, that second layer at least underneath. So with a vertical buttonhole, it takes up less space because they're up and down, they're vertical, to have to reinforce that with another layer of fabric and interfacing underneath so that your button and buttonhole doesn't just rip out of your garment. So when you are wanting to do a horizontal buttonhole, you have to keep that in mind, that you're going to have more reinforcement going in behind the garment where the buttonhole is. So on a lot of button-up shirts, you see a stitching line sometimes, or you see like a separate placket that they use. It's very narrow and it's concentrated in the center of the garment, whether that's in the front or the back or wherever the buttons happen to be. When you do a horizontal buttonhole, we are going to want to have more coverage there. So it goes into more almost like a facing that you want to have when you're thinking about using a horizontal buttonhole. So those are the things you want to think about with the design that you may be creating. If you're wanting to make a garment that has buttons and you want to do, you're deciding which buttonhole is right for me, you want to think about the inside construction of the garment and whether it's okay with the design that you're using, that you have a wider facing for the reinforcement behind the buttonhole. And if this isn't really making sense to you, I know so many of us are visual, don't worry, I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about when we get over to the table. And why delay any further? Let's jump right in. I have an example of something I pulled from my closet so you can see what a horizontal buttonhole looks like and how they did their reinforcement, which I always encourage you to do. If you're looking to put a design into your patterns that you've seen, if you have something in your closet or in a friend's closet, a spouse's closet, that you can take a peek at, or even going to the store and trying to find a garment with these elements, that is going to really help you understand the construction and what needs to go into the pattern to figure out what you're trying to create for your own garment. But I have one to show you. It's really the only one that I could find. I'll show you that, and then we'll get into the draft and how you can do one for yourself. So let's first take a look at this example that I found in my closet. Now, this is a US Army shirt that they probably got in the military. I thrifted this shirt, so I don't actually have any personal connection to Lee, whoever wore the shirt originally. I always think it's so cool to think about the stories of items that you've thrifted, but I love this. I I've had this for a very long time, but it was the one thing that I could find in my closet that had a horizontal buttonhole. So these are pretty, you know, good substantial size button. I think they're probably a military standard issue. So this is our buttonhole, and it is horizontal. Notice that we're not seeing a stitching line to hold the placket in place. And that's what I was talking about, because notice how wide that would have to be, this stitching line would have to be if we were going to do that. So instead, they use more like a facing. So notice that there is an extra piece back here, and they have it on this side as well, where it's more acting like a facing, and it actually goes up into the shoulder a little bit on this side and this side as well. So it's more of a facing so that you can get that extra support all along the whole buttonhole, because you really need that structure for the buttonhole to not pull out and, you know, still be a functioning buttonhole for as long as you have the garment. Now, this is probably a very old garment, and it's still hanging out. Now, these buttons don't really have anything to do with what we're talking about today. There is an additional kind of extra flap inside here that was probably meant for extra coverage. I was never in the military, so I don't really know. So we're not going to be talking about that today, but that's why those buttons are there. But today, I just wanted to show you, you know, why they don't have that extra stitching and why it's a little bit different from the vertical buttonholes, and it really turns into more of a facing application. So that's what I am going to be showing you on the paper. So really, if we just think about it as a facing, it's a little bit easier. Now, a facing, anytime that we do a facing can be a separate piece. So you can have your extension past where your center front line is actually here. So when this is buttoned and it's overlapped, your center line is actually where the buttons line up, so not the edge of the garment. So we need to add an extension, which we'll talk about when we get to the drafting, and we talked about last time when we had the vertical buttonholes. So sometimes you can just have seam allowance and then add the facing as a separate piece. That will add extra bulk to the edge of your garment. So in this case, they've placed it on a fold. There's no extra seam allowance in here, this side as well. So this whole pattern piece, if we were to look at the pattern piece, would be a front plus the facing is extra, and then that is folded back inside. And then in this case, they did top stitch along that edge, so that's not going to roll out or anything. It wouldn't because of these buttonholes, but it's an extra nice way to secure that edge. So that is what it looks like in real garment form. Sorry, I probably should have ironed this for you, but I wanted to at least let you see what it would look like and why we're doing certain things. So now let's get into our own draft. Okay, I went ahead and traced off my basic bodice block front. Now, of course, you can do this same thing in the back if you're wanting to do, horizontal buttons in the back. You can use the same application or wherever you want to add buttons. I'm just using this as reference. So this is my center front line. Remember, we don't have any seam allowance on this yet. And the standard rule for how much of an extension you will need, remember I was talking about that when I showed you the garment, we have our center front line. That's basically where we want our buttons to line up, but we need a little bit beyond that. So we have extra fabric, and it's not just these buttons flopping around on the end. So how we determine how wide, how much to add to that extension is determined by the width of your button. I mean, if you're not sure, you can kind of overestimate. But if you are going to use a 1/2 inch button, let's say, then you could either use the full size of the button. So if I'm going to use a 1/2 inch button, I could extend this out by 1/2 inch. Or the other way of determining this, if you are using a really large button and let's say you think that might be a bit excessive, or you want to figure it a different way. So you either want to go the full amount of the button, or you want to go half of the amount of the button plus 1/4 inch to be a little extra sure. So those are the two ways to determine how wide, how much more you want to add for your extension. In this case, let's just say we're going to use a 1/2 inch button, even though we're working in half scale, just so you can see it a little bit more clearly. So, and I'm just going to say, since we're using a 1/2 inch button, let's extend that out a 1/2 inch. So the full width of the button that we're going to use. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to put my ruler on that center front line at 1/2 inch. And I'm just going to trace along the edge of the ruler. So that will now be the edge of my garment without seam allowance. So this will be the finished edge of my garment, like on that shirt I was just showing you. That's where they did that top stitching edge. Now, when we talked about the facing, we'll get into that in a second. Let's go ahead and talk about the buttonholes while we're here before we get into the facing, to make sure that our facing line is going to cover the amount of the buttonhole that we're trying to create. Now, I like to use that buttonhole extender that I have, that I like using, so I don't have to do all of the math. But wherever you're determining your buttons are going to be, however many you want, usually I determine that first. So if I want to do, let's say I'm going to do them every inch, I'm just making something up, you know, let's put a button here, like lots of buttons. This is probably very excessive, but I'm just trying to get us onto the buttonhole part. So if you had less buttons, or you wanted to, you know, measure it out, you would measure the full length, pick your start and stop point, and then divide that by how many buttons you want to fit in there. Lots of math, or you could get one of those cool handy buttonhole expanders like I showed you in the last video, and that works out really well. So first I determine where I want my buttons to be placed. Then for the horizontal button, it's similar to the vertical buttonhole, as in, so if we have a 1/2 inch button, I'm just going to write that here so we are remembering that that's what we're using for this example. If I'm using a 1/2 inch button, the width of the buttonhole, whether it's vertical or horizontal, needs to be 1/8 of an inch more than the width of the button. So if the button is 1/2 inch, then my buttonhole, so if I look at 1/2 inch and I'm going to add an extra 1/8, would be 5/8. If my button is 5/8, then my buttonhole would be 3/4, so on and so forth. So if my buttonhole is going to be 5/8 of an inch for my hole, where with the vertical buttonholes, we went equally up and down to create our buttonhole. For the horizontal buttonhole, we want to divide it up a little bit differently. So what we're going to do for the horizontal buttonhole, I'll do it down here. So usually you go 1/8 out towards the edge of the extension. So that extra 1/8 that you're adding goes towards the extended part, and then the width of the buttonhole goes into the body. So if I'm going to make a 5/8 of an inch buttonhole, I'm going to put my ruler here, and I can go over this way 1/8 of an inch, and I usually do this, and I draw a little guy there, and then I go this way a 1/2 inch and put my little up and down guy there. So we have the extra 1/8 is going towards the extension, and we have the 1/2 inch going in towards the body. The reason that you do that is when you have a button sewn on, it's more likely going to be pulled towards the edge of the garment when it's worn, because with the vertical up and down buttons, it's just sitting in the middle of the buttonhole, and if it's pulled either way, the buttonhole kind of stays there, it doesn't go up and down. But with these horizontal buttonholes, if it's pulled, you know, if you were to place the button here in the center, it would get pulled all the way to the edge anyway, so your button would end up sitting, you know, farther over than your center front. So we're trying to control the button when it's buttoned up, the garment is buttoned up. We're trying to control that the button will sit on the center front line when it's inside the hole. So the extension is either the full width of the button. So if you're using a 1/2 inch button, then you would have a 1/2 of an inch extension. If you're using a 5/8 inch button, then you would have 5/8 of an inch extension. That's one way to determine it. Or you take 1/2 of the button plus 1/4. So in this case, if we were using a 1/2 inch button, 1/2 of that would be 1/4. And then we would add 1/4, which would equal 1/2 inch anyway. So it would end up with the same thing. So let's say we were using a 1-inch button, we could divide it in half. So we would have a 1/2 inch plus a quarter would be 3/4 of an inch. So instead of having an extension that was 1 inch, we could just have an extension that was 3/4. So that's why I'm sharing with you both ways to figure out how big this extension should be. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in these other buttonholes here. So I'm going to stick with the 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to go an 1/8 inch that way, and I'm going to go a 1/2 inch this way and mark my buttonholes there. So now we have all these buttonholes. So you can see that if I wanted to have, a stitching line, it would have to be a pretty wide stitching line to have enough fabric underneath there to cover the whole buttonhole. And usually when I do this, I mark my buttons with an X. That's just a personal thing, so you know. So in this case, usually like what I was showing you before, we do a facing. So when I do a facing, I usually draw how I want my facing to look on this side before I go over. And usually I'm using pencil. I use marker only because I want you guys to be able to see. So you can decide, how wide do you want your facing to be. If you have like a princess seam or you have some other things going on over here, that might help determine how wide you want this facing to be. Usually I do at least 2.5 inches for a facing. A lot of times I go with 3 inches if this was a full scale. So I think if we did 3 inches in half scale, because this is a half scale bodice, that would be 1.5 inches, and that would be a really good amount. That would cover, so that would cover my buttonholes and leave enough. Now you could go up just into the neckline, or a lot of times, just like on the example I showed you, I like to have it go up into the shoulder. And they just had a very little bit going into the shoulder. That's up to you. You're the boss, you're making the pattern. So I usually do, at least a little bit wider, and I kind of draw this facing shape to where I want to meet the width. So that's me drawing in what this facing is going to look like. And I go ahead at this point, I'm assuming, usually buttons are the last thing I'm adding to my pattern. So if I was going to finish up this pattern, I'd go ahead and add seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then I'll come back and show you what I'm going to do with the facing and why I add that seam allowance first. Okay, I've gone ahead and added all of my seam allowance and finished off my pattern except for this facing. And the reason I do that, you'll see in a second. So in order to get this facing part, because remember as I showed you on our example, it wasn't a separate seam. Now you could add seam allowance here, trace off this facing as a separate piece, add seam allowance, and then you're going to have that seam allowance here on the front edge of your garment. That is an option, having the facing be separate. But showing you like the example that I showed you, this is all one piece. So how I would do it is I would fold along the extended edge, my finished edge of my garment. And ooh, I'm gonna like barely make it. I'm gonna tape a little bit of paper in there because I am just shy. I was wondering if I was gonna be a little bit too short, but isn't that the great thing about making patterns, is that it's out of paper and you can just tape more back on. It's awesome. I wish fabric worked the same way sometimes. I guess you could always seam it, but you have to have seam allowance, and then you're gonna see that no matter what. No one's gonna see this. Okay, so by having it folded like this, I can actually cut this out at the same time. And I'm gonna cut a little bit of this off because I don't need all of this. I only need enough paper to capture the facing. So while it's folded like this, you want to take your needle wheel and needle wheel that facing that you drew on, just like that. Now, you could needle wheel the whole thing and trace it over, but the reason that I wanted to add my seam allowance, this is something that I do, it's kind of a faster trick, is while it's folded, I'm just going to go ahead and cut it out. Okay, the great thing about cutting this out while it's folded is that I don't have to go in and add all the seam allowance that's already included on the front of my pattern. I can just go ahead and cut it out all at once, and then I know it fits exactly into where it's gonna go when it's sewn. So now what I've done is, can you see the little perforations, the little dots from my needle wheel? So I can go ahead and trace that in. That is my facing. Just plain connect the dots. And you want to think about how you're going to sew this. If you are fine just overlocking this edge and having it be that overlocked edge on the inside, that's a very nice way to finish it off. That example that I showed you, that's how that was done. If you want to turn in this edge and make it a little bit more finished, or you don't want to have an overlock, you could add seam allowance to this. I'm just gonna leave it as if we are going to serge that edge, and I can go ahead and cut that off. And that is our pattern. So this is our finished edge. So I would put a notch here with my notcher so I know that that is a fold. You could also put a notch here if you'd like to signify that that is the center front. My center front kind of got hidden by the buttonholes that we added in, but I would make sure that we knew this is the center front, not this. And you would add all of your other notches and everything like you would to complete a pattern. But that would be your pattern. You could just fold that back and sew it with the rest of your garment, and you would have your buttonhole placement. And what I like to do to mark my buttonholes is I will punch with an awl, sometimes on either end of the buttonhole, and you can also punch with an awl where your button placement goes, so that you have that to easily mark onto your fabric. And your buttonholes would go through both layers of the facing and the outer. And you could even interface just this part if you'd like, and have a little bit of extra oomph in there if you need it, or you could just leave it as is. That example I showed you didn't have any interfacing in it, so it also depends on the fabric that you're using and whether you think you'll need it or not. But there you go. All right, I hope you found that interesting, cool, fun. Are you gonna put horizontal buttonholes in your next pattern, or maybe you're gonna stick with the vertical? Let me know down in the comments which kind of buttonhole you are more drawn to and the reason why. I want to hear more. And if you are loving this button video chat that we're talking about here today, please stay tuned for the next video where we are going to do the covered button placket. So what that is do you ever see those garments where it's like they have buttons, but you don't see the buttons from the outside? There's this other flap that goes over to cover the buttons, hence the covered buttons. That's what we're going to be talking about next time. So if you want to continue this button and buttonhole talk, please join us again next week. We post these videos usually every week on Thursday for Tricky Thursday. And if you are loving pattern making and you're like, oh my gosh, give me more, I want to learn more, I hope you will try out my free pattern masterclass. The link for that is down below. It's completely free. It teaches you the very basics of pattern making, and I do teach it in a little bit of a different way than it's usually taught, so a lot of people find it easier to learn. Maybe it's for you. It's free to try out. You might want to check it out and see if you want to continue down this pattern journey with me, because we have a lot of fun around here. And that is all we have for you today. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.